Good afternoon and welcome to Group 5A's presentation of Force and Energy's Relationship with Springs. To introduce this project, we started with an experimental goal of determining what kind of relationship there is between force and energy. Our specific research question was, how does changing whether springs are in parallel or in series affect the relationship between force and energy within that system? A summary of our results was that springs in parallel require more force over a given distance than springs in series, which results in a higher elastic potential energy for parallel springs. Our conclusion summary is that increasing the force to stretch springs over a given distance increases the elastic potential energy. Our experimental design had the independent variable of the number of springs and the way that they are arranged in relation to one another, so series and parallel. We then connected and calibrated the IOLab to the computer and used the IOLab data to connect springs and use constant pull force. We tested each of the springs individually before using them in series and parallel to get their specific spring constants. And then we tested them in series and parallel and used 3 trials for each different spring type. And then we used the IOLab software to create graphs. Some sources of error that might have been possible during this experiment were not being able to pull the IOLab at a constant speed, along with the possibility of error in calculating the spring constants because we used average slope to calculate this. To minimize the error, we used multiple trials of data, used the same springs in all the data collection, along with the same IOLab, and made sure that each IOLab was calibrated correctly and that the same person was used during all of the data collection.
Here we show images of springs in series and springs in parallel. In series, the springs are connected by one end, and then in parallel, they are both connected equally to the IOLab and with the hand. Here's a system schema for a single spring. Their contact force between the spring and the IOLab. Everything has gravity to the earth, and there's also contact force between the table and the IOLab. Here we have system schema for 2 springs in series and 2 in parallel. In series, there are now contact forces between the spring 1 and the table, the 2 springs together, and then the spring 2 in the hand. In parallel, we have both springs have contact to the IOLab and both springs have contact to the hand. You're looking at our force diagrams. These are all springs at rest that are already extended. So if we're looking at single spring, or those in parallel, they would have the same. Each spring would have a force contact to the IOLab and one to the hand, and they're Newton's third law pairs. If we are looking at springs in series, we would have there'd be a force between the 2 springs, and then there's force. One has force to the hand, one has force to the IOLab. All of those again are Newton's third law pairs.
Okay, relating force to potential energy, we know that the work done in the spring is the same thing as the area under the force versus displacement graph. And we also know that work is the same thing as the change in potential energy. We know that the initial potential energy of a spring is going to be 0. So the work done is the same as the final potential energy. So we can see that relationship is that the potential energy of a spring is going to be the area under the force versus displacement graph. In our qualitative conclusions, we see that the area under the parallel springs graph should be bigger than the area under the springs in series graph, meaning springs in parallel have more elastic potential energy. And we see this from our IOLab data that the area under the parallel springs graph is bigger than the area under the springs graph. This makes sense because more force is done to the springs in parallel, meaning that more work is done and the change potential energy should be greater. Thus, the area under the force versus displacement graph shows that the springs in parallel will have more elastic potential energy compared to springs in series stretched over the same distance. In our qualitative conclusions, comparing springs in parallel with springs in series stretched over the same distance shows that the relationship between force and potential energy in a spring changes as you increase the force. More force over the same distance results in a higher potential energy in the spring. And we can see this since parallel springs will have more force. They also have a higher potential energy than springs in series, requires less force to stretch them over the same distance and have a lower potential energy. For the error estimates, we know that the K values are not completely accurate. The K value for a parallel spring should be the first K constant plus the second spring constant. And we can see that this value is not exactly the same. And this is also true of the K value for the springs in series. And so our percent error calculation over here shows how far apart those values actually are. Although this also assumes that our K values for spring 1 and 2 are accurate, but there is likely error in those values as well. Thank you.